The night Abraham Lincoln learned he had won the presidency in 1860, he went home, lay down on a couch, and happened to catch his own reflection in a mirror across the room. And something looked wrong. He said he saw two faces. One was his own, healthy and full of color. The other was stretched over it, ghostly pale, almost like a corpse. So he stood up. The second face disappeared. He lay back down and tried to make it happen again. Sometimes it came back. Most of the time it didn't. He could never reproduce it reliably. And when he told his wife what he'd seen, she didn't wave it off as a trick of the light. No, she gave it a meaning. She believed the vision meant Lincoln would be elected president twice, but he would not live to finish the second term. And here's the strange part. Lincoln believed her. Now, we've turned all of this into a ghost story. The haunted president, the spooky premonition, the dream of his own coffin a few nights before Ford's Theatre. It gets told every April like a campfire tale, proof that Lincoln had some supernatural channel open, some second sight that let him peek around the corner at his own murder. But that reading is lazy, and it misses what's actually frightening about it. Because a premonition is a man being shown something he didn't know. And that's just not what was happening with Lincoln. Think about it. You don't need a vision to tell you what's coming when you've already made your peace with it. The mirror didn't inform him of anything. It confirmed something he'd been carrying his whole life. So the truth isn't that Lincoln foresaw his death. It's that he'd stopped expecting to escape it long before he ever walked into that war. And by the end, the knowing wasn't prophecy. It was just recognition. To see why, you have to go back to a much younger man who had already decided death was simply what happened to the things he loved. Because death got to Lincoln early, and it never really left him alone. His mother died of milk sickness out on the Indiana frontier when he was 9. His father built her coffin in their cabin, and the boy was old enough to know exactly what was being made. His only sister died young, in childbirth, and later one of his own sons, Eddie, died at 3. So Lincoln grew up in a world where death wasn't an event, it was the weather. It came, it took, and nobody got a vote. And it shaped something in him that the people closest to him never stopped commenting on. A bottomless melancholy. His law partner, William Herndon, who knew him for decades, put it about as plainly as you can. He said, melancholy dripped from Lincoln as he walked. So this wasn't a passing sadness. It was the climate of the man. And it got dark enough to be dangerous. In 1841, in his early 30s, Lincoln went through a collapse so severe that his friends quietly took the knives and razors out of his room because they were genuinely afraid of what he'd do. He wrote, during that stretch, that he was the most miserable man living, and that if his feelings were spread across the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face left on earth. Now, that's not poetic exaggeration. That's a man describing the inside of a pit. But here's what he did with it. Out of that darkness, Lincoln built himself a philosophy. He came to believe in what he called the doctrine of necessity, the idea that human beings are driven by forces larger than themselves, that events are mostly fated, and that a person is more an instrument of what's coming than the author of it. Herndon confirmed he held this from his youth. So picture what that does when you stir it together with the grief. You get a man who believes, right at his core, two things at once. That death takes whatever it wants, and that he personally has almost no say in when it comes for him. And that's the seed. Not a fear of death, something stranger and a lot more settled. An intimacy with it. A sense that he and his own ending were already acquainted, just waiting on the appointment. Most people spend their whole lives flinching from that thought. Lincoln had shaken hands with it before he was 40. So when the war came, and with it the most exposed job in the country, he didn't react the way a man fighting to survive reacts. He reacted like a man who'd already answered a question everyone else was still too afraid to ask. And watch what he actually does once he's president, because it's the behavior of someone who has quietly stopped protecting his own life. The threats came constantly, and Lincoln kept them. He had a folder in his desk stuffed with the letters promising to kill him, and he labeled that folder in his own hand assassination. He didn't hide from them, he filed them like correspondence, like a man keeping receipts for a transaction he already expected to go through. And he refused over and over to take his own safety seriously. He'd wander the White House grounds alone. He rode out by himself to the soldiers' home where the family spent summers on a quiet road at night. And one of those nights in 1864, somebody took a shot at him. The bullet went clean through his tall hat and knocked it right off his head. So that's a clear, literal attempt on his life. And Lincoln's response tells you everything. He asked the guard who found the hat to keep the whole thing quiet, because he didn't want to worry anyone, and honestly, he seemed almost embarrassed by the fuss. He joked about it. So a man shoots at your head, puts a hole in your hat, and your first instinct is to play it down so nobody overreacts. That's not bravery in the ordinary sense. That's a man who has genuinely stopped treating his own survival as the point. Now hold that up against what he was doing to the country at the very same time. He was sending hundreds of thousands of young men to their deaths. He signed the orders. He read the casualty lists. He walked through the hospitals and the battlefields and saw, with his own eyes, the cost of what he'd decided had to be done, and he carried every bit of it. People who saw him during the war describe a man visibly aging by the month, the melancholy now fused with this almost unbearable weight. So here's what I think was happening underneath, and it reframes the carelessness completely. Lincoln was spending lives on a scale no American president ever had. And his fatalism, that lifelong sense that he was just an instrument of something larger, wouldn't let him hold himself separate from that spending. He was paying for the war in other men's deaths, and on some level, he seems to have accepted that his own death was simply part of the same bill. Think about it. How do you obsessively guard your one life while you're feeding so many others into the fire for a cause you believe is righteous? He couldn't, or he wouldn't. The same acceptance of death that let him bear the war also quietly removed the instinct to save himself from it. So the question sharpens here. I started out asking whether Lincoln foresaw his murder, but that's not quite it anymore. The real question is darker. What does it do to a man to walk toward his own death this calmly for years, while pretending to everyone, maybe even to himself, that he still expected to walk away? And then the second term arrives, and the calm starts to look less like peace and more like a man settling his affairs. The mirror came back to him in these years, in memory. He told the story to people around him, the two faces, the pale one. He'd laugh it off, and then not quite laugh. Noah Brooks, a journalist close to him, wrote down one of these tellings. And Mary's interpretation, two terms but not surviving the second, sat underneath the whole thing, unspoken and never forgotten. And the dreams intensified. On the morning of April 14th, 1865, the very day he would be shot, Lincoln told his cabinet about a dream. Now, we know this one isn't legend, because his Navy Secretary, Gideon Welles, wrote it down in his own diary that same day. Lincoln described a recurring dream he'd had before nearly every great event of the war. He was aboard some strange vessel, moving fast across the water toward a dark and indefinite shore. And he told them he'd had it again the night before. He believed, because it always came right before something enormous, that great news must be near. So just picture the man saying that. He'd dreamed of moving toward a dark shore, and instead of dread, he read it as a sign that something momentous was on the way. He had so completely merged the idea of great events with the approach of darkness that he could describe sailing toward a shadow and call it good news. That's not a man who fears the dark shore. That's a man who's been expecting to reach it. Now, there's another dream, the famous one, the corpse lying in state in the East Room, the soldier saying the president was killed by an assassin. But that one comes to us through his friend Ward Hill Layman. And I'll be honest with you, historians argue about how much Layman embellished, so I won't lean my whole case on it. And here's the thing, I don't need it. The documented material is already overwhelming on its own. The folder labelled assassination, the bullet through the hat he shrugged off, the cabinet dream Wells recorded, the mirror he kept coming back to. You don't need the spookiest story to be true. The ordinary truth is heavier than the ghost story anyway. And then watch the reversal land. The very acceptance of death that made Lincoln able to lead, to bear the war, to carry all those dead without breaking, is the exact same thing that walks him into Ford's theatre that night. He'd been warned. His own instincts were uneasy. The policeman assigned to guard the door was somewhere else. And Lincoln, who had spent 4 years declining to be protected, who had filed his death threats like invoices, just sat down in the open box with his back to the door. So the fatalism that was his armor all through the war was also the thing that left him completely unguarded at the end. What looked like strength was, in the very same motion, what killed him. We can't know the exact contents of his mind in that theatre. Nobody can. But we know the shape of the man who walked in, and it was the shape of someone who'd made his peace so long ago that he'd stopped flinching. So why did Lincoln know he wouldn't survive his second term? Well, it wasn't because a mirror showed him a ghost, or because a dream cracked open the future. He knew it the way you know a thing you've already decided. He'd spent his entire life intimate with death, convinced he was an instrument of forces he couldn't refuse. And by the time he reached that second term, he'd given himself to the war as completely as any soldier in it. The knowing wasn't a vision arriving from outside. It was the sound of his own lifelong conclusion finally coming due. So think back to that double image in the glass. 2 Lincolns. One flushed and living, one pale and fading. For years, we've read that as a prophecy of his death. But I think it was a portrait of how he actually lived. He was always both men at once. The one doing the work, holding the country together, carrying the unbearable weight. And the one already half gone, already spent, already drifting toward that dark shore. He didn't live like a man who expected to grow old. He lived like a man handing his life over, piece by piece, to something he believed was bigger than him. And the pale face in the mirror wasn't a warning of what would happen. It was a picture of what was already happening. The truer of the 2 faces, slowly winning. By the end, there was almost nothing supernatural left in any of it. Just a profoundly sad, profoundly steady man, who'd known death his whole life, walking calmly to keep an appointment he'd accepted long before the assassin ever loaded the gun. So that's where I land him. And honestly, it's not where I expected to. What I found was a man so worn down and so certain of his own fate that he'd stopped trying to escape it, and somehow led a nation through its darkest hour precisely because he no longer feared the thing the rest of us spend our whole lives running from. I find that more moving than any ghost story, and a good deal harder to make peace with. So let me put to you the thing I keep asking myself. Was that acceptance a kind of strength, the thing that made him great? Or was it the saddest part of him, the part that finally got him killed? I honestly can't decide. Tell me which way you lean down in the comments, because I'd really like to know. And thank you for pulling up a seat on this couch and digging under these old stories with me. If you like what I do here, subscribe and help keep the channel going. I hope I'll see you in the next one.